What is up, YouTube? This is Andrew Rose, and today we're doing the long-awaited, promised for quite a while now, mastering tutorial. Just some things to note before we get started here. I do use a kind of all-in-one mastering plugin called Ozone. I believe Ozone 9 is out, but I use Ozone 8. I think that's true. Or Ozone 8 might be the latest one. I think that's true, though. And before that, I used Ozone 7. So there are other individual plugins that will do each of the different facets of it. Basically, what Ozone does and why I use it is it just has all the different plugins and kind of effects chain you would want in mastering, and it lets you do all of them. So it's more than just these 6 that I use in my mastering chain. There's a lot more. And the general way that I came up with this mastering chain was by watching a lot of YouTube videos of different people mastering EDM, house music, different bass genres, etc., and then kind of consolidating all that information into what would be kind of generally best. I came up with this preset that I use on all my songs and then tweak about a year ago, just over a year ago, I think November 2018. I have it saved, and then every time I make a new song, I just go in and change it. But these are the 6 standard plugins that I'm using, or 6 standard effects that I'm using in my chain. So that being said, you can still follow along, and if you find analogous plugins for these different effects, you can for sure use them, right? A maximizer is just a limiter. The imager is a multi-band stereo imager, etc. I'll explain each one, but as I'm going through, you can just write down what is the actual purpose of the effects. Also, before we get started, I'm tiny bit sick. If you can't tell, I got the winter fever like everyone else, and I've also been going on a bit too much of a bender lately, so that hasn't helped either. But without further ado, we'll go into the intro, and I'll see you afterwards. Okay, so the first thing to note as we jump in here is you'll notice that I have this Resmala Criminals track in here. As I mentioned previously, we actually started the song before this Criminals song was announced or came out. We started the song in like July or August, and Criminals didn't drop until I think October. I think maybe. But it had already come out when we were doing the mastering, so that's why I used it as a reference track. And the best way to go about nailing a master is honestly to have a reference track in the mix down, even, that you can make sure you're leveling to. That way, when you go into the mastering, you're in the best situation to, again, use that reference. So you want to find a track where you think the mix down is really good and that you're trying to emulate the mix of. Doesn't mean you're trying to do the exact same thing in the production, but at least in the mix and master. That way, you have something to kind of base it off of. And in Ozone as well, the EQ and a lot of the other effects will let you do matching using its where you can basically tell it, listen to the other song, listen to Criminals, and then tell me how different my waveform is. So you can see that here. How different is my waveform from the waveform of the other song? Then basically automatically generate an EQ curve to change it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's listen to it first. If you're wondering what these are just very small fade in and fade outs. I was taught that this is needed for radio play and for official stuff like that, so that's why that's there. So I'll just take off Ozone. And for the whole mastering process, I basically just focus on the loudest part being the drop. So that's before. Now with. Okay, so now we'll go through the actual chain. Like I said, I use this chain on pretty much every single song that I do now. The first one is a multi-band stereo imager, and I never really screw with these bands. I keep them the exact same in every single song because they're really the different segments, I would say. So we've got your sub bass, your your regular bass cut into your mids highs, and high highs, basically. So what this is doing is making sure that for absolute certain that your sub is 100% in mono. Now you might be thinking 200 is above sub, right? Like shouldn't sub end about 100? These roll-offs make it so that that's not going to be exact, right? It's going to be mixing. If you look, here it's going to be about 50-50 of each. So keep that in mind. Or sorry, this would be 50-50 each. And then a higher percentage mix of just the full mono signal. Whereas this kind of mid-low section is only slightly being turned mono compared. So if we listen, for instance, we solo this. And just pay attention to this graph. So before, the low bass and sub bass is still not completely in mono. And then if we listen to the next one, you'll notice a much lesser effect. Again, look here. You can also look at this low guy here. It also kind of gives an indication of how extreme it is. So it's barely doing much. And the same can kind of be said for this higher band too, which is actually being spread out a little bit more. So without, again, pay attention to these two. So very subtle effect. And the idea here is, we still want these to relatively stay as we produced and mixed them in terms of their width. As the frequency bands get higher and higher, we want them to get wider and wider, fill out more of that stereo spectrum. Because the frequencies are so much higher, there's a lot less likelihood of them getting to phase cancellation, unlike with the bass frequencies, which is why we want them fully in mono. So that's why we're doing that. And then we'll end off with the high highs. So as you see, it's still quite mono from the original mix. And we're pushing it really far wide. So that's really it for what the imager is doing. We'll just turn off all these other guys as we go along. So here's without the imager. And definitely the most pronounced difference is in that sub area. Next up, we move on to the exciter. So basically the exact same bands here, and it's just what an exciter is basically just a very low amount of saturation, just very slight amount of saturation. And again, we have the same kind of effect where the higher the frequencies, the more saturation we want. We don't really want much saturation going on in the sub because that can very easily become distortion and sound bad, which we don't want. So it's really getting gentler and gentler as we go up. I'm not going to go through each soloing it again, but these amounts are just dialed into how bright we want it. So without the saturation. Now with. And unlike with the sub bass, in this one, it's really going to be the highs that have the largest amount of difference in terms of our perception. Going on again with the same frequency bands. Now we're doing multi-band compression, which this calls dynamics. And you'll see as we go along, as we get higher and higher, we see the same thing repeated. It gets more and more compressed. The only other real ones that are changing are slight changes to the compressor's ADSR, basically. You'll see mostly in the attack and the knee parameters, but also release between the high and the low bands. But the main thing is going to be the compressor here that is pushing farther and farther down, with the lightest amount of compression going on to the bass and the highest amount going on to the highs. Because again, if it's over compressed, which is causing saturation and distortion. We care less about that in the higher frequencies. It sounds more purposeful, especially when we've already had it excited and panned out. It more is giving the feeling of filling the frequency spectrums than damaging the tonality and the harmony like it would be in the lower frequency spectrum. So before and after. So also it's pretty subtle, but it actually is kind of gluing everything together a little bit more. Okay, the next up, this one is actually where a lot of work is going in. So if we, look at it, basically the way that we did this is we have criminals routing into ozone. So it's also going into, now it's on channel 2, but originally it was on channel 1. And we went to matching, target curve capture, played the drop of criminals. It then records it, so I can show you what that even looks like. What you want to make sure when you are doing this is that you turn off the effects chain before the equalizer so that it's not being affected, especially because the exciter and the dynamics effects will fuck with the EQ spectrum, basically. So if we clear this and we capture it, and hopefully I don't get any copyright shit for doing that, but we played just a couple seconds of it, so hopefully that's fine. So you'll see the average curve over here for criminals that it detected, and then it makes this white curve based on how it's perceiving how different our source is. So if we go back into this, you then record your source, so that's the song that you're producing. Turn back on the effects chain, you'd clear it here. Press stop, and as you see, it makes relatively the same curve as it had before, which means that it is mixed pretty much similarly already, but it will just do that little bit of help. And it can be more dramatic. I would honestly recommend that if it's recommending a really big change in the EQ curve, that you go back into your mixing file and address it there. So if it's saying like, oh, your bass is way too low, instead of just boosting the show of your lows in the EQ, go back into the production file and see, train your ear to say, okay, do I need both the kick and the sub and the basses to be louder? Do I just need to compress the basses more here and then give them a little bit more level, or what is the actual issue? I've had that often where I'm like, my kick is as loud as I want to make it, and I feel like everything's balanced, but it's saying I don't have enough low end. So it means I need to compress my basses more, or I need to figure out some other workarounds there. But this is really cool because it kind of just does it itself. If you don't have an EQ that does this matching capability, you can obviously just do it by either by hearing or by sight, right? You could watch the EQ curve of your target and then just try to match it that way. Next up, we have a dynamic EQ. This is completely by my own preference of different. What it does basically is, just so I can show you, if these different bands just get too high, so you see these thresholds that it's being set, so if it goes above the thresholds, it will just start ducking them. Now, I obviously do this for the very high highs because it creates that hissing sound if you have your very high highs going off too much. So it just will start ducking them, kind of like almost like a vocal rider, that's doing automated volume automation, basically gain automation, and then just some other frequencies that I personally don't like. So I would just find out what the frequencies are that you dislike, and then you can set those to go down. And then I would also recommend doing this to avoid the hissing. And then the thing that's really adding most of the loudness is this maximizer. So we'll start it out at the bottom, and pretty much what I do is I just pull down my threshold until I start hearing distortion, and I'll go through one of the ways that I kind of check that. So let's listen to it. So one tutorial I watched suggested that the moment you see this blue come down, that means you should stop. I found that not to be true. You can really just keep going and then go into your equalizer, or not equalizer, your dynamics, solo your sub range, that's 100 and below, and listen for distortion there. So let's keep going. So before it was at 7.5, so let's go down to 8. We're getting 2.6-ish. Now if we go and solo this, we can hear the crackling of distortion in the sub. So I want to just pull back until that goes away. Okay, now it's pretty much gone away. So we can turn the solo back off. And we're still at, a very good LUFS, a really good average loudness. So it's, we didn't have to necessarily listen to that. Okay, when the blue is coming down, that means that it's too loud and you're going to get distortion. We're probably getting distortion at this amount, but it's only affecting the higher bands. So just by doing that check on the sub, we can make sure that we're avoiding distortion so that it's fine to be played on club speakers or louder sound systems without either ruining them or revealing, the bad sounds that we're having. So you can do that in any limiter or maximizer type of plugin, right? I know that FL has its own native Maximus ones that you could do that in as well. So it's just about adjusting this threshold. Also on Ozone, it starts the ceiling at -0.1. It does that for like safety reasons, again, for technical stuff, but in the loudness war, you got to push that as high as you can go. So I found that as well, if I do the blue limit, once it starts showing that it's clipping, I think that's what it's trying to show, but I think it's just compressing normally. Once it starts showing that, you really won't be able to compete with the loudness of studio created tracks that you would hear on streaming services and the radio. So this is the only way that you can really get to the same loudness as those other guys. And then again, just A/B test, set your reference to a second, loop them, listening back and forth, see if there's any more adjustments you need to make, whether that be in the mixing file or in the master, and then you're ready to go. And it's pretty much that simple. So that's been the mastering tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you got to learn something. And I apologize if you can't afford Ozone. Like I said, you can do all this. All the principles remain the same in any other effects chain or plugins you use to mimic this effects chain. I've seen other producers in other genres use a lot of the other effects that are available in Ozone. Like there's a kind of a tape compressor and stuff like that you would use in like pop to emulate old analog gear. If I would recommend you watch tutorials on those different effects if you want to use them. This has really proven to me to be the way to get the loudest, cleanest mix or master for EDM, bass heavy genres. So yeah, I hope that helps, and as always, happy dancing.